So hi everyone, my name's Kate Dodgson. I'm going to be presenting today with Prithvi, so I'll just ask Prithvi to quickly introduce herself.
Hi everyone, this is Prithvi Hirani and it's very nice to be here.
Thanks.
I'm from IOM, sorry.
No problem. So Prithvi and I are going to be presenting today on AI ethics in the humanitarian sector, and more specifically on the work that we've been doing together through the Data Science and Ethics group. So a couple of years ago, I worked for an organization called the Data Science Initiative, which was an initiative of the City of The Hague. So The Hague wanted to know how AI could be used for peace, justice, and security. As the city of peace, justice, and security, they wanted to go further than the law and policy. They wanted to look at how technology could work with that as well. So I was working with them 2 years ago, and because The Hague is also the home of the UN OCHA Center for Humanitarian Data, and of course 510, I became interested in humanitarian sector and how AI has been used in the humanitarian sector. So I started interviewing UN agencies and NGOs and saying, are you using AI or data science? Can you tell me about it? And through doing those interviews, I got connected to the IOM DTM team. And Prithvi will explain who they are in a minute, but just for everyone who's not familiar with this, is the UN system, IOM is the UN Migration Agency. So when I got connected to them, I said, are you doing data science? And they said, well, look, we're interested in it, but we're also nervous about the potential risks it could raise. So we're looking at the moment at the ethical issues and what we should be prepared for. And I said, okay, well, that sounds really interesting. Let's join forces. And then we started working together. So that was about 2 years ago. And they told me that at that point, they had a couple of sort of meetings with other UN agencies, with other NGOs on the topic of data science and its potential and of course its risks. And we decided that we would try and formalize sort of the outputs of those meetings. So, and that's when the Data Science and Ethics group became formalized. So I'm going to pass over to Prithvi now, who's going to talk about what happened with that formalization.
Okay, thank you, Kate. So as she mentioned, I work for the IOM, which is the International Organization for Migration, and it's the UN Migration Agency. And specifically, I work for this unit called DTM, which is Displacement Tracking Matrix. And the DTM basically collects migration and displacement data from over 70 operations across the world in humanitarian context, ranging from disasters, sudden climate changes, or any kind of violence and conflict and so on. And as one of the largest collectors on internal displacement across the world, our data is used to inform lots of humanitarian operations as well as larger humanitarian planning and processes. And in recent years, the humanitarian system as well has undergone a significant amount of change, whereby it has not necessarily been immune to the changes and technological advances of the world that we live in. And in that sense, data has really proliferated, and so to speak, we have had an emergence of a humanitarian data ecosystem. Within this, of course, DTM is a very important player, but it's not the only player. And in that sense, concerns and issues around the possible and growing risks of this data that is available. It's all open source and increasingly shared between humanitarians, which of course is a great thing, but also the risks and potential misuse that it also raises brings up a lot of questions for us. And in that sense, that's very much seen as the reason for the inception of the Humanitarian Data Science and Ethics group, which brings together a community of humanitarians across different UN agencies, as well as academics, researchers, lawyers, data scientists, who share very similar concerns from diverse points of views, but very strong and similar concerns when it comes to the risks. Because if you think about, even if we just take the case of DTM, for example, the availability of displacement data that provides the basic information for any humanitarian response, be that answering the questions of who, what, where, how many, which in many ways is central to a humanitarian response. But when that data can be, as you all are the data science experts, but when that is combined with other data sets, it may reveal, or it could be used to model and do predictive analytics, etc., or forecast certain things that may have unintended consequences. And from that point of view, we've all come together in this group to bring principles and practice together. But also, I mean, it was also very nice to see in Jacopo's slides as well, the questions of data responsibility, humanitarian innovation, protection, data protection, humanitarian principle and standards to come together under what we call the humanitarian data science and ethics. And this is where our story kind of begins. And Kate, if you go to the next slide. Exactly. So as part of this process, we started initially mapping what the different concerns were, what were the concerns that were emerging from the field, but also in terms of, keeping in line with all the sorts of technological innovation, but also questions around changes in the humanitarian sector at large. And I think at that stage, some of the main 5 concerns that came about were questions around peer review. And when we say peer review, we mean specifically talking about from a technical point of view, where we would have, the review of code. And in that sense, OCHA has taken the lead in terms of, providing guidance on this. But when it comes to questions of accountability, communication, inclusivity, and transparency within the humanitarian sector, as well, and as the humanitarian sector also evolves and starts to use technological innovation and so on, these kinds of questions underpin what technological innovations would look like, how and in what ways would AI models and data science be used. And in that sense, accountability, communication, inclusivity, transparency, all of these kind of form the overarching umbrella for us as data ethics in general. And in many ways, it brings together the technical, but also the operational and the practical side of things. And as we merge these different circles, as we showed in the previous slide, how can we take all these things into account, but also ensure that we do move forward and do use the available technologies to improve humanitarian response. So that's where our kind of ethical framework developed and began. And it was published last year in April 2020. And soon after that, in November, we also developed a decision tree to kind of make operational and practical the way in which this framework works. But I will actually let Kate explain to you how our framework works.
Thanks, Prithvi. So as Prithvi just said, we produced a framework, and what we wanted to do was look at the data science journey. So starting from inception, all the way through to building the model, all the way through to relying on outputs. And we wanted to identify and flag all the ethical issues along the way, and then offer guidance for overcoming them or mitigating them. So deciding what the life cycle looks like was really difficult, because some of our partners were saying, there's 30 steps along the way. Others were saying, no, there's only 3. We ended up settling on these 5. So the 5 stages you see on the left-hand side. And, no project's going to run perfectly from 0 to 4. Some will start in the middle, some will go back and forwards, but we thought, what could a project look like if you were to start from inception and go to completion? So with each of these stages, as I said, we've raised as many of the ethical issues that we've flagged along the way and talk about how to overcome them. As you'll see, we have a stage 0, and that's because we think that there are some fundamentals everybody should have a basic knowledge of before going any further on a data science project. And if you see in the description, we list what we think those fundamentals are. We think people need to know the humanitarian principles, such as do no harm, humanity, neutrality, impartiality, etc. It might seem like chicken and the egg because we say that you need to know AI ethics before you read an AI ethics document, but what we mean is you need to know the basic AI ethics. You need to be aware of bias. You need to know what transparency means. So just getting a bit of a grasp as to why people even talk about AI ethics. And we flagged some issues about human rights as to why can a machine affect human rights, and things like data responsibility. Then you'll see with stage 1, we still don't actually get to data or technology. In stage 1, we're kind of looking at the innovation process where we're saying there's a bit of a temptation these days to get this shiny new technology and go, let's find a problem for it. And just, there's grants out there that say, we're looking for AI solutions, give us a problem, please. And experience has shown this isn't the way to do it, because you're going to try and push a solution that doesn't, the problem isn't fitted for it. So stage 1 here, we just make sure that people who are interested in using AI, we want to say, put data science out of your head for a minute, really focus on what the problem is. And if once you've explored the problem, if AI is still a potential solution, then get it back in your head and then we'll start addressing it. So then from stages 2 to 4, then we really start looking at the technology. So chapter 2 is quite a long section because it's looking at data ethics, and that covers collection, sharing, storage. And just to give you sort of a little example of a more sort of nuanced ethical issue that people might not be immediately aware of as regard what happens in the humanitarian sector, is to do with data collection. So a lot of data collection in the humanitarian sector still happens manually. It still happens through interviewing affected communities, either with paper and forms, or it could be done digitally immediately. But that involves asking questions, and that involves the affected communities answering. And if you've got multiple NGOs doing this for multiple different reasons, that's question after question after question. You could end up with sort of assessment fatigue. And if say you're trying to assess what food needs are in a refugee camp, for example, if they're asked by multiple NGOs, they're exhausted of answering, you start to become suspicious. Why do you need so much information about me? Why do I have to keep producing this? What are you doing with this data? Are you securing it? Is it being shared with other people? And these kind of things don't happen to us, to you and I, when we go to the supermarket. We can just make our decisions. And, so it's sort of the ethical issue there is, do you need to keep asking these questions? So if you're a data scientist and you want to create something, think about, what data do I really need? Do I really need it? If I don't need it, perhaps I shouldn't be collecting it. So we talk about these kind of issues in the data chapter. I'm going to briefly talk about the algorithm chapter because I'm pretty sure a lot of people in this room know a lot more about algorithms than I do. And the team data scientist isn't here to correct me. But I will note that the very first thing we mentioned is that there are already lots of tools out there that already exist that can help you with reviewing your algorithm. And in fact, 510 have one, which looks at algorithms of equality and fairness. So we direct people to other resources that can help assess whether or not algorithms have been done ethically. And finally, a subject which I am quite comfortable talking about is the reliance on outputs. So presumably, if you're using a data science tool, it's because you want an output and you want to do something with that output. It might be that things are automated, so a decision's made by a machine, by the data science tool, and that something automatically happens from that. Or it gives some information which a human then makes a decision on. So it sort of produces evidence. And the reason this is an issue, there's a number of reasons, but I'll give an example. There's a really great report called Bots at the Gate, which is written by a friend of mine who's a lawyer. And she looks at the Canadian immigration where she suspects, and there's not too much evidence, but there's a bit of evidence that shows that the Canadian Border Force is potentially using AI to help determine refugee status. And with something like that, if a decision is made against a refugee, in the normal court of law, there are appeal processes. You can appeal against facts, or you can appeal against law, and you know what levels you can appeal to. You can appeal against the immigration officer, you can appeal to a tribunal, then to a court of appeal, etc. But if that decision's been made by a machine, who do you appeal to, and what are you appealing? Are you appealing the data that was put in to the algorithm? Do you know what was put in? Are you appealing the parameters that the programmer set? Are you appealing the decision maker who didn't weigh up that output closely enough against perhaps in-person interviews? There's so many of these issues, these ethical issues, that we don't know the answer to these yet. And if it went to court, would a judge have the capacity to understand how the machine had made this decision? So what we wanted to do is just show that even in circumstances where there are still human in the loop, perhaps, in this same example, an immigration officer were to use an AI output suggesting that perhaps this person is lying about being persecuted in their country, so they shouldn't get refugee status. And they've also had an in-person interview with that person, and they've sort of seen what their personality is and sort of gauge whether or not they believe them. What do they give more weight to? And so we want to make sure that people who are using data science realize that these are going to have effects on people. So if they end up giving more reliance to the machine than the interview, then you're going to get some pretty biased outcomes there. So that is the framework. And what we ended up doing was getting all this information, and we wrote a 50-page document, which sort of runs you through all these stages, raises all these ethical issues. And then we thought, you know what, not many people are going to sit down and read a 50-page document. Fair enough. At least all the information's there in one place, but we realized that you might want that information in a different format too. So we created a decision tree, which is basically just, I'll show you the next slide, which actually shows it in its full. What you do is, again, the color code here reflects the stages that you saw in the slide before, so stages 0 to 4. And you go to a website and it would ask you a question saying something like, do you know the basic human rights issues associated with AI? And you click yes or no. If you click no, it'll take you to a web page that says, okay, well, here are some resources you can look at, but we've summarized them here. And then when you get to the data stage, it'll ask you questions. Are you collecting primary data? Yes or no? You click yes, and it'll take you to the next question, and it'll start giving you advice about how to collect primary data ethically and responsibly, etc. So it's basically all the information that we had in the framework, which we just put into yes and no questions so that people can just click yes and no, go through. It's much easier to digest, and it links to all sorts of different resources. And the idea being that someone at an NGO or UN agency, or even a techie who's interested in doing something for the humanitarian sector, can come up with their project, use this decision tree, run through it, see what areas they're not confident in, what areas they think, oh, I probably need to do a little bit more work on that. And at the end of it, you come out with a certificate that says you have considered the ethical considerations. Not your project is ethical, but you've been presented with the issues along the way. It's your choice to proceed, but at least you've addressed them, at least you've acknowledged them. And that's our slideshow finished. So the Data Science and Ethics Group, we're an open group. We are always keen for more people to join. The reason IOM, DTM, and myself are sort of the spokespeople for it is just because we just decided to go with it. We're always happy for more people to join. And yeah, just curious to hear what the questions are, if anybody has any more suggestions. And just to know, this is both the framework and the decision tree are living products, for living documents. There are some chapters in there we think could use more information, and if someone's got a particular area of expertise and they say, actually, I think I could help with this area, then get in touch with us, and we're always wanting to add to it and make sure it's as comprehensive as possible. Thank you.
Yeah, wow, that's impressive and extremely useful. So thank you also for the talk. Hand raised. Okay, I think we have the first question. Alonso, if you want to unmute yourself.
Hello, Kate. Can you hear me?
Hi, yes, can hear you.
Thank you for the wonderful talk. I have a question on block 2. I think it's data journey, you called it. And it's about data collection. I've been participating in enough data projects where you realize only late that you have forgot to collect data that would otherwise be useful for analysis. And I don't represent any stance, but I want to hear yours, because sometimes you would hit the argument that it would have been better to think a little bit less about design and just go for a safe call and collect more data than you probably need in case that you end up needing that data later on. What's your stance on that?
Prithvi, I think you might be better positioned for this one.
Yes, you read my mind. I think I think that in many ways we really think about especially the amount of data that exists, and I'm particularly an advocate of data minimization, and more data does not necessarily mean better data. And I think that encountering a problem whereby your data show and needs emerge at a later stage of the process in many senses means that that the design process has not been conducted properly. And I think that that's exactly why even within our framework we really do emphasize the fundamentals. Even before you begin collecting data, it's also very important to think about how one is situated within existing data, but also what identify the gap, why exactly are you collecting data? Also, collecting data, particularly in the humanitarian sector, is also very expensive, time-consuming, challenging, especially in hard to reach conflict situations, as well as when you're dealing with vulnerable populations, and also, as Kate mentioned, populations that may experience not only very challenging and precarious conditions, but also may face assessment fatigue. And in such situations, I think especially it's very important to have a data minimization approach and try and it of course is easier said than done, but at the same time having an approach towards data collection in general where you fully understand and link your questions very clearly to indicators, I mean, is very, very important, because I think more data is not necessarily good, to answer your question.
I understand. Thank you so much.
Okay, we have a question from Maya.
Hi. All right. I sort of squeezed myself in because I have a question that builds on this. I was wondering, when you talk about sort of the hardship of collecting the data in the field and the expense and also the issues with over asking, is there any sort of new data forms that we can think about that might at some point replace the need for this kind of data collection? So I think about maybe mapping migrant stream with satellites, or checking cell phone data, or maybe even looking at animals as they flee certain scenes, because they might be an indicator that people are also on the run. So I was just wondering whether it would be possible to just step away from this personal data completely at some point.
I think that's a very interesting question that you raise. I don't know, Kate, if you want me to take this or if you would like to answer it.
Oh, yours, Prithvi.
Okay. I think, I mean, in many ways, of course, data collection is evolving, and the use of CDR to collect data or supplement data for migration when it comes, or mobility patterns when it comes to very specific examples, is a good kind of use of trying to use to try and incorporate new ways of collecting data. But I think this is where exactly our work becomes really important and pertinent, because when we do try to use different modalities for data collection, what are the ethical concerns that may come about? And also, I think it's also very important to bear in mind the difference between the data that exists and data that is collected. And within that, there is a very underlying and important question of consent and informed consent. And the question of privacy and accountability and those sorts of things are very, very important also to consider. And I think personally speaking, like a human rights approach to data is very important, and also like face-to-face interviews are very, very important when it comes to building trust, and never really forgetting that, humanitarianism is also ultimately about people and about serving the people that we are responsible, who we say we support. It shouldn't really fully distance you from that process completely.
There's also the possibility of, in some situations, there's multiple NGOs and agencies working in the same place. And if they're all collecting the same data, then that could be potentially rectified by data sharing. But then that brings up a whole new basket of ethical issues, because should you be sharing data? Has it been protected properly, etc.? So it's just, yeah, more ethical issues, but we run through that again in the decision tree. So we start with data collection issues, and then we move over to data storage and data sharing. So they all got their own issues.
And also, just to add to what Kate was saying, when data is collected by humanitarians in the current way that it is, its initial use and purpose is clearly explained. Whereas if data is used from other, like satellite imaging sector, or through modalities that may not necessarily, the data that is collected, its use is completely different, or is used by different actors. I think there are certain ethics that come about and need to be addressed, and need to be thought about, even if the intention is to do good.
Yeah, thanks. It's a good answer. I fully agree with the part on thinking about the intent and or sort of the implications for the person. But I guess at some point, is it still personal data? This is just a thought. I don't necessarily need more answers, but is it still personal data if you map like bigger streams of people, or like when does personal data end becomes the question then? Because if I followed my GDPR course correctly, then if it's not personal data, then many of these concerns are less stringent, of course, not only from a legal perspective, but also from an ethical perspective. Because if it's not personally identifiable data, it doesn't really say much about any person. Just a thought I had, but very clear and good answers. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
It's also demographically identifiable data, right? It's not a GDPR category. Demographically identifiable data. So many levels.
Okay, Mirzad, I think you had a question as well.
Yes. No, thank you for the talk. Awesome. I had a question about if I look at the latest developments in the AI world, I just gave two examples. One of them was the OpenAI and how it is advancing and how it is going towards commercialization, while the initial intention was not to be commercialized, but we see that is changing. And if you look at what is happening, for example, with the Google ethics team that is being wiped out slowly. So I'm just wondering whether you see a way of bringing back the ethics of AI into the organization, especially the commercial world. I see one of the risks that I see is that maybe at a certain moment, the commercial world and AI will be so advanced that everything else will be redundant. And nobody will talk about the ethics of AI. And my second question was about if there would be three biggest asks that you would like to ask or you would like to see change or happen. What would those be? Thank you.
I can start with the first one and say we wanted the AI ethics, both the framework and the decision tree, to become stronger and sort of not legally binding, but binding on organizations the same way that the humanitarian principles are. And we have been speaking to donors, the governments that are doing most of the funding of these things, to say, look, if you're going to give grants to people using AI, perhaps you could make this a requirement so that organizations can't use AI until they have proven that they've considered all the ethical considerations. So that's kind of something that, we're going to keep trying. I think that's probably our best angle to get donors, because otherwise it's just self-regulation. It's asking each organization, could you please do it? But if they want money, then we can, perhaps we could require them to do it. And I know governments are all working on the moment. I sat on the Scottish government's AI ethics board, and they're really struggling with these issues because it's sort of ethics versus industry and economics. So you've got the people saying, let's go fast, let's go forward, let's break things. And then you've got the ethics people saying, hold on, let's do red lines, let's think about this. And it's hugely conflicting. So governments are struggling with it too. And I know with the EU, when they were looking at AI ethics, they started off by saying, let's have some red lines. Let's talk about some subjects like the autonomous weapons and say that is illegal. We're going to say no to that. And right up until the very last stage, there were red lines. Then last minute, the corporate lobbyists sort of came in and managed to get rid of it and water it down. So it's a real shame. And exactly what you said about Google's AI. A lot of people say it and then somehow it just disappears over time. And we hope that doesn't happen to us, but we'll keep trying to do that, I guess, through donors and getting organizations to sign up to it and make it visible.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's very important, I think. One thing that I would like to mention, there's this discussion going on in the community about taking a very different approach, and that would be, why not make sure that every individual owns the data? And then there will be no centralized model of data collections and data gathering and data analysis, except if the user, individuals that own the data or create the data, give consent every time. So maybe that would be something to make sure that the organizations wouldn't even be able to take disadvantage and just wipe out the ethics.
I'd love to own my own data. I'd be happy with that. I think there's not, my perspective is there's not enough interest amongst most people. So we're all here because this topic interests us and we're concerned about it. But most people don't know. And if they do know, they don't care. So, but I think the biggest problem is not knowing. I think a lot of people would care if they knew the extent of it. Yes. But until we get sort of the masses to understand and care about it, that kind of stuff won't really be pushed ahead.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. Oh, the second question, your 3 biggest asks.
I'll try.
Yeah, go Prithvi.
I think that's a really good question. And I think that I was actually reading something recently that I think would be quite applicable. It's such a basic point, but when it comes especially to thinking about AI in the humanitarian sector, I think, you know, when accountable artificial intelligence is lacking, even in non-emergency contexts in parts, you know, in parts of Europe and the global north, expecting it to be, you know, the likelihood of artificial intelligence in emergency contexts in the global south can pose a lot of risks when it comes to, you know, it's dramatically increased when it comes to the risks to already vulnerable populations. So within that thinking, I would say, if you ask me what would be 3 biggest asks for the data science and AI community, I would say more accountable AI, because as I said, you know, the humanitarian sector is not immune to technological advances in general. So if and more AI becomes more accountable, it will automatically kind of percolate, and its use will automatically kind of be incorporated and, you know, influence the humanitarian sector. And in that sense, you know, it's very much learning through that and it coming together, because the humanitarian sector increasingly is partnering with the private, you know, the private sector. And in that sense, I think accountable AI that thinks about ethics and you know, kind of has a human-centered approach, as Jacopo was also sharing in his presentation, I think would be super, super important from my point of view, because it's not that we can't technologically advance and use these different and improve the existing methods that we have, as even Maya's question suggested, but what is the best way of doing that while ensuring that, you know, there are no risks that we're putting people at, and also before we kind of experiment and take technologies to really vulnerable populations, we should make sure that we're not doing, you know, we would not advocate for technologies that we ourselves feel uncomfortable about. So yeah, I think accountability should guide the sector.
Okay, thank you.
I think Victoria has still a question. I unfortunately missed this earlier, so my apologies, Victoria.
No worries. I think one of the questions was were actually aligned to what Merced was asking, so is answered. I guess 2 questions. One, so a couple of us from Correlate, we're sort of responsible for scoping projects for data scientists to be doing our volunteers. And I was thinking of the different steps that you had. And one of the first steps were, okay, so what if data science isn't, the answer? Is there actually a problem here? Do you have any advice how we can be better at scoping projects and not, I guess, forcing data science projects upon maybe a challenge that can't be solved on data science? A way for us to shift our thinking there. That's the first question. And the second question is, you mentioned that it's an open group and you encourage involvement. In what capacity can people, become involved in the data science and ethics group? Or yeah, thanks.
Sure, so I can jump on the first and maybe Prit can take the second. So in the decision tree and in the framework, we say that there's a sort of a problem recognition stage, and in humanitarian innovation, that's what you can do a sort of series of workshops, facilitated workshops or workshops yourself, series of activities where you really get to explore the problem. You do user stories, user journeys, you get to know who are the people, what's their daily life like, what's the problem with accessing them, and you ask all these questions and you piece together sort of a storyboard. And that's sort of the first step where you really get to know the challenge. So what we do is we tell people to undertake these exercises and we link them to online tools and workshops that they can use and they can go through. And we say that, so once you've gone through those stages, if you're still satisfied that AI is the right one, then we suggest you can proceed. But even then, we don't say go straight to data science. We then say, look for partners, look for collaborators, look for people who have done it before and do some desk research, read their stuff. So there's sort of two steps. There's problem recognition and there's search solutions, search and collaborations, and then you can get to data science. So yeah, I suggest just using the decision tree or the framework and using the tools that we've linked there because they're quite well-established ones. So, and I'll give Prit the second question was how to collaborate with us.
Are you muted?
Oh, sorry. No, I was just going to say, Victoria, the fact that you're even thinking about the fact, about your approach in and of itself is really important, right? Because that's exactly what we're trying to dispel, that techno solutionism, where people just want to use technology very quickly or just be like, this sounds cool, this sounds really exciting, we should just do it and then find a way to apply it. And even as you with your group of volunteers and your expertise, taking a step back and thinking about how and where is exactly how we want to, we see that process to begin even. And it's good that you're thinking about it, and I'm sure you will apply that in your approach more and more. But when it comes to partnering with us, we're very open and excited to basically, the way we think about it is from the technical, the practical, the operational, and each the data science and ethics group has a broad range of expertise, and we'd be very happy to get your feedback and input from the technical side in terms of using the decision tree, as you were saying, when it comes to identifying problems to use as well, maybe try and put it through the decision tree and see what use case example works, doesn't work, and whatever feedback that you have could be really useful to us in terms of not just improving it, but also helping us build a resource in terms of informing other users, as well as, in many ways, we want DSEC to be this collaborative open space for different groups that are also thinking about using using AI and data ethics in a very responsible way to also learn from each other's projects. So in that sense, we really do want to build a community. And if you're interested in contributing towards, as we said, the development of the decision tree and its different branches, if there's something specific that you think would add value or could help us grow, then yeah, get in touch with us, and we'd be very happy for our team to set up a call and discuss things. And that goes to everyone, in this room today. Feel free to reach out to us, and we have a very exciting team, all of whom have very broad range of expertise, and I think, yeah, we'd be very happy.
Great, thank you. Exciting.